1965. The jungle vibrates with the sounds of war. The roar of Huey helicopters drowns out the thunder of bombs exploding miles away. In the middle of the scene, an experienced soldier stands out from the rest. The thick, humid air makes him uncomfortable. Suddenly, he misses the cruel winters of his native Finland. Despite being twice the age of many of his comrades, he has proven to be a unique warrior, and boy is he. This is Larry Thorne, who bears that name despite being born Lauri Törni, and this is not the first time he has fought against the communists, although it was not always under the flag of the United States. In this new video, we will learn about the incredible life of the only soldier who fought for completely opposite forces, those of the Third Reich during World War II and the Americans in Vietnam. Stay with us to be amazed by this exciting military history. Our protagonist was born on May 28, 1919 in Viipuri, Finland, under the name of Lauri Törni. From a young age, he was known in the village not only for his ability to lead games, but also for his sense of honor and justice. Often, when he saw older children bullying the younger ones, he intervened without hesitation, facing them with a bravery that seemed to surpass his age. His father, a veteran of the Finnish Civil War, watched him with pride and some concern. He saw in his son a spark that made him different, a rebellious spirit as admirable as it was dangerous in times of uncertainty. Towards the end of the 1930s, tensions were growing throughout Europe, and the Nordic country felt an imminent threat from the Soviet Union. By then, Törni was a teenager who demonstrated all her potential and vocation for service. He was determined to prepare himself in the best way possible to go to war and defend his flag.
Törni soon proved to be highly athletic, and he was childhood friends with future Olympic boxing gold medalist Sten Suvio. After attending business school and serving with the Finnish National Guard, a 19-year-old Törni enlisted for military service in 1938. Only a year later, as the rising Nazi regime invaded Poland, a war between Russia and Finland broke out. The Winter War began in 1939 when the Finnish government refused to give up large tracts of their land to the Russians, who attacked in retaliation.
After the Soviet attack, the Finnish army took up positions to contain the enemy offensive. That brings us back to young Törni, who during military training had distinguished himself for his discipline and tactical skill. He had a natural instinct for leadership and was quickly promoted to sergeant. His superiors noted that although he was young, he had a clear vision of combat and a serenity in making decisions under pressure that distinguished him from others. The Winter War against the Soviet Union finally shaped the identity of that nascent hero who sought to protect his home and his people. In the cold trenches of the battlefront, he showed courage and cunning that made him famous among his comrades. Thanks to his personality, he was tasked with leading a series of night raids behind enemy lines. He accepted that challenge, not knowing that it would be the first step in forging his legend. Lauri Törni was placed at the head of a unit of young soldiers, men from his community, who had left their families and fields behind to defend their homeland, but without the training of a true warrior. At just 20 years old, he had to lead them into battle against a formidable troop made up of fierce communist fighters. The burden on his shoulders was great, but the bravery and skill he demonstrated allowed him to quickly gain the trust of his people. The Soviet war machine advanced with the certainty of its numerical and armament superiority. But the Finns had something that the enemy underestimated: knowledge of the terrain and the will to fight to the last breath for their freedom. Using guerrilla tactics, ambushes, and skiing to move quickly through the snow, Törni and his men became a major headache for the Red Army. One night in December 1939, our protagonist led a daring operation behind Soviet lines. His small squad, moving silently under the cover of darkness, infiltrated a camp. The snow muffled the sound of their footsteps as they approached the supply depots. With deadly precision, they attacked the unsuspecting guards and set fire to the ammunition, causing an explosion that lit up the night sky and caused chaos among the rival troops. As the flames rose, Lauri Törni led his unit back to the safety of the forest, suffering no casualties. That victory, though small compared to the scale of the conflict, became a symbol of Finnish resilience. The feat resonated across the front, boosting the morale of local troops and striking fear into the hearts of Soviet soldiers. After months of intense fighting and thousands of casualties on both sides, the Moscow Peace Treaty was signed on March 12, 1940, ending the war. Finland ended up losing large chunks of territory, but that didn't stop Törni's men from returning home as heroes. He couldn't rest, though. He had seen the Soviet threat up close and knew the truce was fragile, so he left for Austria to continue training.
In 1941, Törni traveled to Vienna to train with the Waffen-SS, a military branch of the Nazi regime's Schutzstaffel organization consisting of Germans and volunteers from occupied and unoccupied nations. He was itching for payback against the Soviets after the humiliating loss in his home country. By the time he completed his training, Törni was promoted to Untersturmführer, the SS equivalent of a lieutenant. Soon, Finland would again engage in combat with the Soviet Union as part of World War II.
When Operation Barbarossa began on June 22, 1941, the Finnish soldier found himself fighting against the Soviet Union again. Only this time, he was under the flag of Nazi Germany. Nevertheless, Törni focused on his great goal of reclaiming the land for his country. Within that framework, on June 25th, just 3 days after the Third Reich invaded the Soviet Union, a separate chapter of the conflict began that was called the Continuation War. This was the name given to the battle that once again pitted Finland against the Soviet Union, and where our protagonist was able to put all his experience to the test. He was put in charge of a special commando unit known as Törni's Company, which was distinguished by its intensive training, its ability to operate in extreme conditions, and its focus on guerrilla and sabotage missions.
Around this time, Törni was severely injured when he accidentally skied over a landmine, but he recovered and returned to fight the Russians. He was such an effective guerrilla warfare soldier that the infuriated Russians put up a bounty of 3 million Finnish marks on his head, the only time the Red Army had offered a reward for a Finland native.
The battle was fierce and lasted for several years until 1944. During that time, there were victories and defeats for the company, but the bravery and determination of the leader earned him the respect and absolute loyalty of his men. They saw in him a true symbol of the country's resilience. When it became clear that the nation could not continue fighting the Soviet Union indefinitely, the government in Finland decided to negotiate an armistice that ended the war. The Continuation War ended on September 19, 1944. The Finns once again found themselves in a precarious position, forced to cede territory and accept harsh terms in order to preserve their independence. For Törni, the end of the fighting was a devastating blow. He had given everything for his country, and now he felt that his sacrifices had been in vain. But more than that, he sensed a deep betrayal by his leaders, who had abandoned the fight and left his people at the mercy of the Soviets. It was then that he made a decision that would change his life forever. Instead of accepting defeat, he decided to continue the battle, looking for a new cause to serve. Disillusioned and with the firm conviction that the Soviet threat was not yet over, the soldier decided to flee his country. Through contacts in the resistance, he managed to reach Sweden, and from there he made his way to Germany, where he found temporary refuge. Once again part of the Waffen-SS and motivated by his desire to continue the war against the Red Army, he was assigned to the Nordic Guerrilla Battalion. The unit was made up of volunteers who shared his hatred of communism. Although Törni was never a fervent follower of Nazism, he saw the Germans as a necessary ally in his personal fight against the Soviets. By the spring of 1945, the Finn was training a battalion in guerrilla tactics and sabotage. However, as the war in Europe drew to a close, he realized that the Third Reich was doomed. In April of that year, with Allied forces at the gates of the German capital, Törni and his unit were sent on a desperate mission to try to break the Soviet siege around Berlin. It was a fierce fight, and although our protagonist led his men with courage, it was clear that the war was lost.
The captain didn't have a way to return to Finland and found himself stuck in the collapsing Third Reich. A few months later, Törni had no choice but to surrender to Allied troops and was sent to a camp for prisoners of war.
Törni was captured by British forces and imprisoned with other Nazi prisoners sometime between April and May 1945. During his captivity, he reflected on the decisions he had made and the paths that had led him to this point. He wondered if he had really done the right thing by joining the Germans, or if his hatred of the Soviets had clouded his judgment. The soldier had been detained in a camp in Belgium, but apparently the security of the place was not a challenge to his skills. No one knows how. But the Finn escaped from the compound and managed to return home, only to find an unpleasant surprise upon arrival. In his absence, he had been convicted of treason and rearrested.
In 1947, he was sentenced to 6 years in jail, but he again escaped months later and was recaptured. President Jugo Paasikivi eventually granted him a pardon, and he was released in December of 1948. Törni then traveled to Sweden, where he fell in love with a Swedish Finn, Maria Kops. But wanting to establish a career first, he traveled to Caracas, Venezuela, as a Swedish seaman. He then got a job at a Swedish cargo ship bound for the United States.
Through a series of contacts, Törni had managed to emigrate to the United States in 1950. He changed his name to Larry Thorne, adopting a new identity and a new purpose. For him, America represented a land of opportunity, a place where he could start over. He settled in Brooklyn with other Finnish immigrants and spent a few years working as a carpenter, waiter, and cleaner, until in 1954 he returned to a life he missed. He enlisted in the U.S. Army, looking for a way to channel his skills and experience into a new path. In the American forces, he found a second chance to serve, not only a country, but the ideals of freedom and justice that had always guided his destiny. Larry Thorne was ready for a new war, on a new continent, and with a new flag flying above him. Despite the initial suspicions of some senior officers because of his past with the Nazi ranks, his tactical skills and exceptional leadership quickly earned the respect of his peers. The man now known as Thorne proved to be a tireless soldier, eager to learn and willing to share his guerrilla knowledge with others. The higher-ups in charge of his evaluation noted that he had a unique combination of practical experience, unwavering determination, and a strategic mindset that made him an invaluable asset. Thus, he was assigned to the 10th Special Forces Group, a newly formed elite unit created to carry out unconventional warfare operations and clandestine missions behind enemy lines in the event of a conflict with the Soviet Union. It was a scenario that was familiar to this soldier. Little by little, Thorne proved how valuable he was in different exercises and operations under the American flag, and the time came to return to a large-scale conflict. It was 1961, and tensions in Southeast Asia had taken on great relevance worldwide. Once again, communism was on the opposite side, challenging our protagonist's side, although this time it was in a different scenario: Vietnam. The United States was increasingly involved in the Civil War there, and Thorne was called into service.
Once in Vietnam, he became a trusted advisor to South Vietnamese soldiers in the Mekong Delta. During his service in the war, he earned a Bronze Star for his bravery and 2 Purple Hearts. In 1965, Thorne returned to Asia for a second tour. He was then assigned to the Studies and Observations Group, a highly classified multi-service special operations unit that conducted covert unconventional warfare missions.
In this context, his unique skills were key to the battle. With his vast experience in covert operations and guerrilla tactics, he was perfect for the task. However, the challenges were great. The jungles were a completely different environment than the cold forests of Finland, and the soldier had to quickly adapt to the new realities of jungle combat. Our protagonist worked closely with local forces, forming a special bond with the Hmong soldiers, an indigenous group that fought fiercely against the communists. Thorne's ability to communicate across cultural and linguistic barriers and his respect for local customs earned him the loyalty of his troops. The experienced soldier led multiple raids into hostile territory, using ambush tactics and hit-and-run attacks that paralyzed the enemy. During one of these missions, he and his men found themselves caught in an intense firefight with a superior Viet Cong force. With his troops running out of ammunition and no immediate chance of escape, Thorne made a bold decision. Together with a small group of soldiers, he launched a surprise attack that disorganized the rivals, allowing his main team to retreat to safety. Although he was wounded in the process, he never showed any signs of pain or hesitation. For him, protecting his own was the only thing that mattered. As the war in Vietnam escalated, Larry Thorne was put to lead a special forces team on search and rescue missions. These operations were extremely dangerous, involving raids into enemy territory to recover downed pilots or capture high-value targets.
On October 18, 1965, Captain Larry Thorne would oversee an air-based mission to identify Viet Cong positions on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. But his helicopter crashed merely 5 minutes after takeoff due to poor weather conditions and visibility. The Army first listed Thorne as missing in action, but his status was later updated to killed in action in South Vietnam. Rescue and recovery teams searched the mountainous area 25 miles from Da Nang, but they could not locate the helicopter. The Army even sent some units to Vietnam that showed pictures of Thorne to locals, but no one recognized him.
Larry Thorne's disappearance left a void in the Special Forces, and his story became an inspiration to other fighters. The United States eventually withdrew from Vietnam on March 29, 1973, and 2 years later, the Communist Viet Cong won the war. The loss of valuable soldiers had been in vain. Several years later, in 1999, a search team was slowly walking through the dense Vietnamese vegetation. Among them was an elderly Finnish soldier who had known old Lauri Törni before he changed his name. After days of searching, they came to a small hill where they found the remains of a Huey helicopter, covered in moss and vines. The metal structure was rusted, but still recognizable. Around the site, scattered among the vegetation, were fragments of military equipment, remains of uniforms, and finally some human bones. There was also a barely legible plaque with Larry Thorne's name on it. Beyond that, the soldiers' remains were only formally identified in 2003 and buried on June 26th of that year in Arlington National Cemetery, along with other victims of the Vietnam War.
To this date, Lauri Törni remains the only former member of the Nazi Army to be buried in Arlington National Cemetery, the most hallowed of American burial grounds.
During the farewell ceremony, veterans from different wars and countries gathered to pay tribute to a man whose life transcended borders and conflicts. Representatives from Finland, Germany, and the United States were present, all of them recognizing Thorne as one of their own. This is how we come to the end of this incredible story, with a soldier who participated in 4 major conflicts under 3 different flags, leaving a legacy that served as an inspiration to many warriors who pursue their ideals of freedom. Thank you very much for having accompanied us until the end. We look forward to seeing you in our next video.